Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and to our European attendees, good evening. And thank you for joining us for today's webinar presented by Ziflow. My name is Mike Peterbaugh, and I'll be one of your hosts for today's call, our first in a two-part series on Agile Marketing. So we have just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Attendee lines are muted to cut down on background noise like leaf blowers and barking dogs, or in my case, 3 children under the age of 9. Although I will be not on mute. Our session today is being recorded, and a copy will be sent out today after we finish up, along with an invitation to our second part of this webinar series. And we'll take questions at the end of today's presentation, but please feel free to enter them at any time during the course of the webinar through the Zoom Q&A interface. If we see them during the course of the webinar and we can kind of jump out of context really quick to take the question, we'll be happy to do it. But otherwise, we will take them at the end. All right, with that, let's meet our hosts. As I mentioned, my name is Mike Peterbaugh, and I'm the CMO here at Ziflow. And I'm joined today by Will Liu, our VP of Ops, who leads both our operations team and our customer success strategy, in addition to being one of our in-house Agile gurus.
Hi, everyone. Excited to have you on the webinar today.
All right, great. For those of you who aren't familiar with Ziflow, we are singularly focused on innovating in the online proofing space, helping agencies and brands worldwide solve their most pressing review and approval challenges. If this is something you and your team are looking for help with, you can find out more information on our website at www.ziflow.com. Okay, let's jump into why we're all here today. As many of you are familiar with, Agile development techniques are once again really gaining momentum in marketing circles because in many ways, modern marketing technology increasingly has parallels with software development and even IT projects. And this momentum is driven by a few factors, which we'll dive into first before getting into ideas on how to harness technology to accommodate an Agile approach. Those you probably are thinking about a number of factors that might be driving that, and maybe that's what brought you to the call today. This webinar, as I mentioned, is the first of two. Today we're going to cover the why and the how. And in our second webinar, we're going to talk about at the end of which we'll talk about at the end of today's call, we'll get into the what, where we'll walk through examples of how our customers are incorporating online proofing specifically into their Agile workflows and processes with other technologies. So we're going to cover the idea today and also start to kind of scratch the surface at which technologies we're going to be demonstrating and showing next month in our next webinar. Then we'll actually get into the actual technologies in that webinar. So real quick, I wanted to look at what I'm generously calling a vast oversimplification of the Agile approach. I just wanted to set a little bit of context for the rest of today's call. This pretty much applies to software development as well, but for our context here today, we're talking about the creative production process. And in the traditional development scenarios that you start with a big idea, you do some planning and a brief and some research, and then your creative teams hunker down for a pretty significant creative process, and then ta-da, a big reveal. Then you get another new idea and start the process over again. And in an Agile approach, there's an accelerated method to planning and design, which incorporates an emphasis on collaboration. And we're going to talk about that from several different angles today, collaboration in that context. And it's specifically around the feedback loops, something we're going to dive into as well, not only in this webinar, but in the next webinar as well. We're going to be discussing that quite a bit, both the idea of collaboration and feedback, and really it's collaborative feedback when you meld them together. And then insights in this process shown here, insights drive adjustments and a return to a quick collaborative iteration. And again, this is a vast oversimplification. I think there are a few Scrum Masters on the call that are very well steeped in Agile that are probably giving me some serious side eye right now. But for those of you on the call who are just coming up to speed, this should give you the context for our discussion moving forward. So if you've been on our webinars before, you know that we like to start with the why. And in this case, why would the creative process benefit from an agile approach? And there's a few significant drivers. One is, I think would be kind of these core challenges that creative teams are faced with today. So in 2019, we commissioned a survey where we looked at the challenges that creative marketers were faced with. And to cut to the chase, we saw three main themes rise to the top. And if you've been on one of our webinars before, you know that we do focus and center around the 3 C's. It's really what we focus on as not only from a thought leadership perspective, but also within our product, within Ziflow, trying to ease the challenges around content, collaborators, and compliance. And each of these factors sort of paint a picture as to how Agile can drive benefits for a creative marketing team. So let's just get into each of these examples. First, on the content side, probably goes without saying, marketers are creating more content than ever before. As part of our research, what we saw was 60% of the respondents are managing at least 4 projects or more weekly, and 33% are managing 6 or more weekly. So that project overload, that struggle is real. So that's the content challenge. The collaborator challenge, and this is where we start to get into starting the discussion around the feedback loop. Weak feedback processes are amplified as project counts increase. So as the demands and the number of projects and the number of marketing channels and campaigns are requested, weak feedback process, there's just a huge light shown on those. And as you can see, almost 80% of the respondents that we surveyed say that they encounter regular issues with getting feedback on their projects. What are those issues? More than half said it was vague or non-actionable feedback as the challenge. So really imprecise feedback, which kind of caused a lot of back and forths and really slowdowns. And then almost a quarter identified it as key stakeholders. They were the ones that were holding up the project, either not being able to get their feedback incorporated, or they just weren't providing the feedback in the first place. And all of these issues kind of roll up into a crescendo around compliance. So more content, more voices, and now more, maybe restrictions is the wrong word, but more restrictions or more needs to prove out, which drives even a greater need for process. But it's also a really interesting balancing act, which we see on a daily basis, which is to move and act quickly, but with the requisite approvals and guidance that is needed for an effective marketing compliance program. So for those 3 C's, content, collaboration, and compliance, when those come together, you can see how those challenges get amplified and accentuated in today's, and what I mean by today's, talk about the last 90, 120 days, this new reality of work from home and remote working. The creative processes, which used to rely on the big reveal, they don't really scale well for today's new normal. And here, I'd like to get Will's input. Will, what's the biggest thing you think you've seen in terms of change since our new kind of work from home normal has taken hold as it relates to how our customers are working?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Mike. One of the things I really noticed, and I love the fact that you used the word scale here. One of the things that we've noticed is that a lot of the processes that people are using for creative review and approval just doesn't scale when they're no longer in the office and when they need to work from home. A lot of clients that we're seeing, they have to reimagine or reconfigure their workflows within a tool, even like Ziflow, an online proofing tool like Ziflow, or if they don't have an online proofing tool, they have to create a brand new methodology and process for creative review and approval. Well, what I've seen is a lot of dependencies on a lot of the workflows were dependent on everyone being in the same place, being able to ask each other questions, popping over to each other's desks. So what we've had to do is really kind of reimagine their overall processes and workflows to account for things like things need to be handed off quickly and efficiently, and keep that feedback loop constantly moving so it doesn't get stuck or lost anywhere.
Yeah, that's a really great point. The old, the hallway conversations, the kind of the open floor plans that don't exist anymore. Those were, actually, probably really effective ways to try and keep your processes moving, but they don't really scale, as Will pointed out. So that's a great point. So let's roll. Now that we've talked about the why, I think we've set a pretty good stage. You know, marketers are being asked to do more than ever before for more channels. That's not a new concept. The number of stakeholders is increasing, and you know, there's actually one topic we didn't even cover, but you know, with a lot of brands now taking a more introspective look at their brand and how they're communicating in today's kind of social climate. You know, lots of products names have been changed. Marketing directions are being shifted. You know, there's a lot more stakeholders involved. That's a key point I should definitely want to point out too. And the more stakeholders on the more projects, you're adding in the complexity. I think setting the stage for that why is important. But the new additional why now is this. The work from home new normal is definitely something that has kind of added some complexity to the process. So let's roll into a few examples of the how to drive agility in the creative production process, and which technologies. So we're going to start to introduce some ideas around technologies and how they play important roles. And again, this is a great another excuse for me to point out webinar number 2 in the series, where we're actually going to demonstrate how these technologies are being used by our customers in Agile methodologies. So the first component of Agile that we want to discuss is actually, I would actually classify it as a superset, really. And it's the idea of rapid iterations. And I know Will's got a lot of thoughts on this as well too, so I'm going to throw it over to Will in just a second. But I just want to kind of set the stage on the slide. First and foremost, you and your team have to be super efficient with the ability to accommodate change. That's new requests for projects are probably one example, but probably the most common example being within a project being that feedback, which drives change to designs or new information which changes the direction of a project. In the Ziflow context, which we'll get into again in our next webinar in this 2-part series, there are a few different ways to support rapid iterations. From a technology standpoint, both with and without Ziflow, as Will mentioned, all of this really does apply whether or not you're using an online proofing system or not. It just really depends on how you want to extend and embed your online proofing capabilities. But from a technology standpoint, both with and without Ziflow, leveraging key technologies such as like native design program plugins, which is a mouthful, it's a great way to stay in context while at the same time getting rapid iterations done and shared for the next round of feedback. Also, DAM solutions are really important here to keep approved iterations stored and cataloged. And also, I don't want to miss or not highlight the importance of cloud storage here as well, which not only is obviously a good storage method, but can also be leveraged in really innovative ways to kick off new projects in a very friction-free manner, which we'll be demonstrating again in our next webinar. But Will, is there anything here that you want to add and want to talk about as far as rapid iteration? I know we have some more stuff coming that we'll discuss around the feedback loop, but as far as like rapid iterations are concerned, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Mike. I think the biggest thing that I've noticed on rapid iteration as I've been working with our customers, getting them going, helping them to improve and transition from being in the office to working from home is that I think the biggest thing that jumped out to me, and you've touched on it, is that the need for technology, our integrated stack has really exploded. So the amount of integration requests that I'm starting to hear from our customers has definitely gone up by orders of magnitude in the last couple of months as people have transitioned from being in the office environment to working from home. I think that there's really 2 parts to that. I think it's people want to work faster now. So the rapid iterations of staying in the tools that they're already working with is going to be huge. But I also think that with the transition of working from home from an office environment, there's also a need to get information to people faster, and they need to start using tools that they may not be leveraging. So what we're seeing is there's a larger demand for integration with project management tools like Monday or Asana or Trello. There's a larger demand for integrations with Ziflow with communication tools such as Slack or Teams. People are essentially asking us to get information from Ziflow into these other systems faster, because that's where they know their team members are, so that they can get these rapid iterations, so they can no longer wait for that feedback loop of it being handed off to the next person or someone else telling them that it's ready for them to take a look at. They really need all their tools to communicate each other to support this agile methodology of rapid iteration. And we're just seeing a huge demand for these integrations. And we're continuing to build out these integrations to allow Ziflow to talk to Teams or Slack or Monday or Trello or Asana to allow people to stay in the environment that they're working in. I think it's also allowing them to work in the production tools that they're working in as well. One of the things that we released recently that you know, Mike, is the Premiere plugin that actually allows video editors to stay in the tool that they're working in, but still get all the feedback from the proofs itself. So we're definitely seeing a larger demand for that as people are trying to work faster, but also more efficiently in an agile methodology to allow for these rapid iterations.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think you really do point it out as a best practice. And it's a nice segue to this slide, which is why I skipped ahead to this slide. It's at the end of the day, allowing team members to work in systems they're most comfortable with. In the long run, that's going to grease the skids, not only for being more efficient, but just for people adopting the process. And I think it's a really key and core point. And thank you for bringing that home, Will. It is probably one of the first things that we talk about with our customers when we start, building out a Ziflow deployment is, well, what do you use today, and what do you want to continue to use to be successful? And there's always going to be the core set of users that are in, your online proofing or a core application. But there, as we've talked about, as stakeholder counts grow, they're not always going to be in that core application that you're in, but yet you're still going to want them to participate. And on the other side, not just a stakeholder, but a contributor, like the Adobe Premiere plugin, as Will mentioned, staying in the context of their hour. I mean, I don't want to call it day to day, their minute to minute, their hour to hour work. Staying in that context is incredibly powerful. People to kind of stay in that flow state, in the zone, if you will, and being able to accommodate that and allow team members to, as the slide says, to work in systems they're most comfortable with. Is a huge, it's got a compounding effect, which again, if you've been on our webinars before, you know that Will often talks about the compounding effect of good efficiency gains. This is definitely one of those compounding effects. Staying on this theme a little bit longer of team members and stakeholders and the variety of applications is the need to set up a friction-free feedback loop. That's another mouthful. Agile isn't just about getting things done quickly. It's also about efficiently incorporating feedback sources and information and adjusting and improving accordingly. And again, just like I was saying, you can grease the skids here significantly if you start looking at the apps that people use every day. But when it comes to the feedback loop, and I want to turn this over to Will to share some of his experiences, this is not only where we get the bulk of our integration requests from customers, but it also highlights the opportunity for just the idea of workflow as well. Will, I'd love to have you share your insights on both of those. I think you talked a bit about the integration requests, but maybe if you want to talk about workflow as well.
Yeah, Mike, you know how I feel about workflows. We did a whole webinar on workflows, and I think workflows is really the key driver to allow for an agile methodology. I think a couple of things that I really tell people to consider and the benefits of a workflow. If we think in agile, blockers can happen for two ways. A blocker could happen because I don't have what I need to move the project along. And a blocker could happen because I'm waiting on someone to give me information or give me what I need before I can pick up the task. So where workflows really come in to help your feedback loop is by ensuring that it gets to the right people at the right time. If, for example, compliance gets to that proof before copy takes a look at it, so compliance is actually looking at that proof before copy even has a chance to approve that copy, then all of a sudden I created a blocker for compliance. So rather than creating a quick feedback loop, rather than truly working in an agile methodology, I've really created a waterfall effect where everyone's in here at the same time. We're working on this big project and we're introducing blockers by having an improperly set up or improperly structured workflow. So really creating an agile creative review and approval process, having a workflow is critical to that, but having a properly set up workflow is key. If you attended our webinar last month where we took a look at benchmark metrics, I think one of the things that we've really seen, taking a look at millions of proofs that have gone through Ziflow, is the impact of workflow and how workflow truly allows you to capture feedback faster and iterate quicker. Um, One of the most interesting things that really kind of threw me off when I first saw the metric, but after digesting for a second, I actually understood it a lot better, was when we took a look at the impact of workflow on video proofs. Video proofs with workflows applied to them averaged more than 2 times the number of versions and 4 times the number of decisions on compared to video proofs without workflows applied to them. But even though there's more versions and more decisions, what actually happens is that the turnaround time was cut by a third. So these proofs were actually able to turn around, these video proofs were able to turn around in 35% less time. And that's really where the workflow supports an agile methodology. It allows people to get their feedback in faster, but at the correct time. So now things aren't becoming blocked and you're not waiting for someone else to review it before you can pick up that task again. So really two things support this feedback loop. It's the workflow, absolutely, but it's also making sure that your workflow is properly set up so that you're not introducing blockers within your feedback loops themselves.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. And I think in some of the key technologies to consider that what we're being asked by our customers to help them set up Ziflow to work with. Traditional project management, as Will mentioned before, is a great way to extend and create these feedback loops. Also, some may argue it's the same thing, but to get very specific, issue tracking and management. So maybe for those of you on the call who are familiar with Jira from Atlassian, we're actually a Jira shop here at Ziflow and Ziflow Marketing. We use Jira as our agile marketing approach. Those are technologies definitely to consider when you're thinking about setting up these robust feedback loops, and then also real-time messaging. Will mentioned Slack and Teams, very popular request, and also a really effective way to keep team members engaged. And also, we're going to talk about the pitfalls to avoid. One of them would be not to leverage the ability to keep people engaged. And if they want to consume kind of the quote unquote raw updates, to let them. So yeah, so that was a great point, Will. Thank you. What the next point I want to talk about is transparency and visibility, which is another core component, of Agile. Keeping progress, and to be fair, sometimes it's the lack of progress too, out in the open, is a key part of Agile culture. I'm going to skip to the bottom, just make a very, maybe it's an obvious point, but I just want to get it out in the open. This is often the hardest element of Agile to achieve at the outset of the process, is getting everyone's, deliverables, status, and progress kind of out in the open. My mom likes to say that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and it's very true. I mean, I think the openness does help remove impediments, but it also shines lights on resources needed. I think that's probably the positive way of looking at it. I believe that Nordstrom, when you work at Nordstrom, they say there are no problems, there are opportunities. There are opportunities to improve, there are opportunities to shine. And that openness is definitely, I think, is kind of mirrored into the Agile method as well. And it really does promote that direct collaboration and what I like to kind of call pragmatic prioritization. Updating things on the fly, making sure that it's not just about meeting deadlines either. It's about getting the right resources and the right things done in the right order. Kind of going back to the key technologies to consider, definitely project management, real-time messaging here. I think that is definitely a couple of core technologies that you'd want to, I would say, maybe dedicate to this area within Agile. Okay, there are some pitfalls to avoid, or at the very least, I would say to account for as you look at your creative process and the opportunity for Agile. So, and Will, please jump in here as you see needed, as you see fit. I put a few on here to talk about at a very high level. I think we've talked about probably the majority of them throughout this call, but the first pitfall that you want to make sure that you avoid is look past the point, you want to basically look at the point that we've made over the last few slides about leveraging systems to keep people engaged. As we've said, doing the upfront work of allowing team members to work in their own apps and still contribute to the creative process. And that's either by giving feedback or consuming updates to keep an eye on progress. I think we firmly believe here at Ziflow that'll pay off significantly over time. The second pitfall, which I'd like to highlight, is to really challenge the silo-based approach and get cross-functional teams in place to create really dynamic teams. We're going to spend some time on this in our next webinar, talking about how workflows can accommodate super dynamic teams while ensuring no one is sitting around waiting for work. If you don't want to wait for that discussion, we did an entire, as Will mentioned, we did an entire webinar on workflow. You can find it on our resources page on Ziflow.com, Ziflow.com/resources actually. I would strongly urge, if you've got a hankering to start poking around and maybe challenging your existing workflow and figuring out like how you can get more, cross-functional teams built, effectively leveraging workflow in the review and approval process is a great way to do it. So definitely that's one way to kind of challenge the whole silo methodology, is to get cross-functional teams working together is via workflow. And lastly, I would say definitely be prepared to optimize over time. The pitfall here would be setting up your process and just letting it run until the team decides finally that they don't want to do it any longer because they hate it because it's so rigid. When we decided to incorporate, I guess that's the best way of me putting it, when we decided to incorporate an agile marketing approach here at Ziflow in the Ziflow marketing team, the first thing I said when I got on the team call as we started to kind of look through it and effectively kind of step through a presentation, not unlike this one, about how we would think about things and maybe how we would incorporate some technology into our process. The one thing I said that agile, we will make agile our process. We're not going to let agile make us their process. So you should definitely feel like you can make this yours. And I think that's, being able to, prepare to optimize over time is an important one. One thing, not to get too deep in the weeds, but in Agile, there's a concept of a retrospective that you do at the end of your, your predefined work period, which are called sprints. We didn't really get into too much detail about the nomenclature and the I would say the techniques within Agile, but some of the techniques, there's this concept of sprints. We work in 3-week sprints here in Ziflow Marketing. We meet at the beginning of a 3-week period. We all agree on what the goals are for the company and the marketing team for those 3 weeks. And then we we start to describe what we're going to work on, and we start to put deliverables in place in Jira specifically. And then my job as a marketing leader at that point is to make sure all of my team has the resources, that they understand the mission, and that I remove blockers out of their way. But at the end of that 3-week period, which was actually this morning before today's webinar, we did our sprint recap, and we also did our retrospective. So retrospectives, you go over and say, what could we improve? What should we stop doing? What should we start doing? What do we need to do more of? And just general improvements. So in fact, like I said, we did our retro this morning, and one of the areas we identified was actually a workflow improvement in our marketing automation system, so that we could better report on the industries of our contacts and customers. So that was a nice kind of process improvement that came out of a discussion after the conclusion of our last sprint. Just a quick result, and it's something that we can build on. And as Will likes to say, there are compounding benefits for that. Okay, well, wow, that was a good coverage. Before we get into questions, though, I wanted to make sure everyone knew about our next webinar that we talked about. So just as a quick recap, today we talked about the why and the how. Our next webinar, we'll talk about the what these integrations can look like in your creative production process. We'll cover mainly in the Ziflow context, but there are some, definitely some best practices that wouldn't require Ziflow incorporated into it, and we'll cover those as well. So we're going to be borrowing examples from our customers to share. and show you examples of how you can use the apps that you use every day, like Monday.com, Jira, Slack, Dropbox, Microsoft Teams, and even Google Drive if you wanted to kind of help streamline your creative processes and make them more agile-like. And that's going to be on August 25th, and we'll be sending out an invite to that webinar when we do our follow-up on this webinar with the recording and the slide deck, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that was a lot to take in, and I appreciate you and thank everyone for hanging in there with us so far. And what I'd like to do now is go to the Q&A. And I saw that some questions did pop up during the presentation. So let's see what we got here. Let's see here. Oh, here's a great question for you, Will. Well, I mean, I can take it, but I think this would be great for you. Are there ways to still incorporate a big reveal if you're working with an external team, which in my case means clients, but still be agile? It's kind of it feels like a trick question, but I've got some ideas, but Will, I wanted to throw it over to you and see if you've got some ideas as well.
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. I love that question. Absolutely. It really comes down to how you structure the workflow. So whoever asked that question, please feel free to reach out to us and we can talk about your specific workflow and the best ways to construct that. But it really just comes down to how you construct the workflow. So if you are trying to save some of the magic for the client so that they don't see the assets of the big review, there's a ton of different ways to say it. There's a ton of different ways you can set it up. You can essentially have the client not involved in the process until final approval. So you can go through multiple rounds of iterations. You can have 1 version, 10 versions, and the client doesn't even know that you're going through all these iterations. We'll never have context of that until they finally hit their specific stage in the workflow. They won't be able to access the previous versions. You can set private comments to keep your feedback internal from them. And one of the coolest features that Ziflow has just released that can help support this is the ability to actually skip stages on versions. Kind of advanced feature. So like I said, if you were the one that asked this question, absolutely feel free to reach out to me directly and happy to give you a tour of the workflow or take a look at yours. But essentially, you can build the workflow so that this one asset continues to move through all the iterations and all the revisions and all the feedback. But ultimately, when the client gets access to it, they feel like they're looking at it for the very first time on a clean version without any of your comments or any of your feedbacks, because you've built all that in a private, you've built all those as private comments with your stages set up correctly. So for your clients, they still have that magic of the big reveal, but internally, you're iterating constantly and you're really pushing this proof through all the feedback loops and capturing all that feedback, but your clients don't know any of that's going on.
Yeah, so you covered exactly what I was going to cover. I think it is a great question because, and I think it's, a great point to point out that it's, and maybe it's not just unique to the agency client type of relationship, but yeah, there still is the need sometimes or the desire to do a big reveal. And, I should point out that earlier slide that I showed, it wasn't to say that you couldn't do the big reveal. There are definitely, as Will has pointed out, some really innovative ways to kind of stick with that. And still be agile. So Stephanie, thank you. That was a great question. I'll actually reach out and see if there's maybe if we can demonstrate how that would work for you specifically. I'll be reaching out, or actually a member of my team will be reaching out here soon. So great question. Thank you, Stephanie. Next question. This looks like it's probably directed to me, but Will, if you want to jump in here as well, I'll take the first cut at it. What was your team's biggest resistance to implementing Agile? Great question. So I don't know that we had a huge resistance. I'll tell you, maybe one of the things about transparency was we did go through some iterations or some evolutions, I should say, not to conflate the terms, but some evolutions around how we were describing the work tasks that we were going to do in Jira. I think we went from we've actually spanned the spectrum. So we went from broad to maybe a too ambiguous as far as what we were describing, what with the work, the atomic units of work that were to be done. we went from maybe too ambiguous to almost too granular, where we were creating, maybe way too many items or issues in Jira, to find a good balance. And then also, working on how we were going to do handoffs, because, we work very collaboratively here in Ziflow. Our digital operations team, our digital marketing team relies on our creative team. Our research team relies on our demand team. Our content team relies on everybody, and everybody relies on our content team. So there were a lot of, there's a lot of handoffs as far as tasks were concerned. So we had to learn a lot about that. I wouldn't say there was any straight resistance. I will say the first change we made is, I don't know if it's industry standard. I don't know if there is one that's industry standard, but we started out doing 2-week sprints. And one of the, I would say, the challenges that we saw internally was just some of our projects were spanning longer than 2 weeks, and the team was a little bit resistant to having to keep carrying over things to new sprint. I think it's almost, maybe it's just as psychological as anything else of not having something completed in a sprint. But just projects take longer than 2 weeks. It's very common. We actually extended our our standard sprint now to 3 weeks. Which works for us. So I wouldn't necessarily call it a resistance. So I'm sorry I'm not answering the question specifically. Will, I know you've worked with other Agile teams, outside of Ziflow. Any resistances that you've seen as far as trying to implement Agile?
I think the biggest resistance is always the process change. It's making sure that I think a lot of people get hung up in building the perfect Agile process without considering how it's been done previously. And that's where I see a lot of the resistance, saying, hey, this is the brand new workflow that we're going to follow, or this is the brand new process that we're going to follow. And it's a huge deviation from how they're currently doing it. So one of the things that I really say is, let's figure out your current workflow, and let's really get that mapped out. And then we'll pick areas for improvement, and we'll pick areas for iteration. But where you get a lot of resistance is if you go from 0 to 100 right away. So touching on one of the pitfalls that you talked about earlier, Mike, is it's being scared to iterate against your current Agile process. So one of the things that I always like doing as I'm helping people adopt to Agile is really saying, what's your current process? What are areas that we can improve on right now by adopting some of these things? And what are areas that we should consider in the future, weeks from now, maybe even months from now, that we want to continue to improve as people get comfortable? So you don't need to do it all at once. You can slowly phase it in. There's a ton of different ways that you can do that based on how you set up your workflows or even set up your processes. But it's really one of those things that you constantly want to iterate, and it may be better to introduce it slowly to the team.
That's a great point. That's a great point. We have another question that just came in, actually, which I now wish we had our buddy Rob on the phone with us, Will. Great question. The iterative nature of Agile seems suited to digital marketing. Do you find that it's harder to work in an Agile environment when working on something like print? We have a lot of print customers here at Ziflow. But I think it's a great question, Will. Carolyn, who asked the question, I'd love to get you on the phone with our colleague, Rob, who actually used to work in preprint and print. That was his industry. Those are his people for sure. But, I don't know, Will, if you've got anything that maybe from your experience working with all of our print customers that might apply.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. I think the iterative nature of Agile seems suited to digital marketing, but you can really take the concept of Agile into something like print. A couple of ways that you can approach that is really thinking about one of the benefits of Agile for digital marketing is the ability to iterate quickly, right? So you can make changes as people are giving feedback, and you can limit the blockers. Now that's not possible with print, but one of the things that you could do is taking that Agile concept is you can define, and I've said this in a previous webinar, but you can define your definition of done. So you can allow for faster iterations and avoid things like version creep or things getting out of scope, even on your print projects, by better defining your definition of done. So when do you consider the feedback complete on this print job? And when are you taking it to iterate on it and making that change? You don't want to do it too soon because you may be making the changes before the feedback's finalized. But if you wait too long, which is what happens with a lot of print jobs, then you're slowing down the project. So one of the really big things that I recommend for agile methodologies for print is really defining what your definition of done is. So at what point do you say, this is all the feedback that we're going to take on this project, and we are ultimately going to make a new version and iterate on this feedback? There's a ton of different ways to do it. A big one is deadlines. I'm huge on deadlines. If you haven't heard me say it before, set a deadline. You always want a deadline. Even if you're not really going to use a deadline, set a deadline. Then you can say your definition of done is when the deadline's passed. Or what you can do is you can set a frequency in which you action on the comments. So this is when all the comments have labels applied to them. This is when all the comments have been resolved. So while Agile really does lend well to digital marketing, you can still take those same ideas and concepts and apply them to print. And really what you want to do is set your definition for done, choose when you're going to create those, take all that feedback and create those new versions, and also how you start organizing and actioning on that feedback. Is there a way that you can organize the comments so you can start iterating on some sooner? Or is there a way for you to keep everyone abreast of the changes that you're making based off of those comments? So now they're not making conflicting comments. So there is definitely a ton of methodology things that you can apply and leverage that with an online proofing tool that creates the visibility for the entire team.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Will. And Caroline, thank you for a great question. And I'll actually have my colleague Rob follow up with you and see if there's any best practices he can share. He's got a wealth of knowledge in that area as well. And that actually is it for questions. I want to thank everyone for attending. Like I said, we will be notifying you about our part 2 of this webinar with, we'll be actually getting into the product and showing how these integrations would work and how they would contribute to an agile approach. If you don't want to wait, please don't. If you'd like a product tour today, please go to ziflow.com/demo. And a member of Will's team would love to walk you through how we can help you and your team support an agile methodology. I want to thank everyone for being on the call today. I appreciate your time, especially our European attendees. It's really impressive. Thanks for hanging in there with us. I want to thank my co-host, Will. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and knowledge, Will. It's always appreciated. I'm going to sign off for now. I'm going to say thanks, and we'll see you on our next webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.